Hello, I'm Molly Coffey. I am the co-creator of Film Impact Georgia. I am a production designer working here in Georgia, and I'm also a writer and director and used to be a filmmaker in residence for the Atlanta Film Society, which is how I am here. I'm very excited to be talking to Christopher Glass immediately upon Linda Burns reaching out to me and asking me if there was anything that I wanted to do for the creative conference this year for Atlanta Film Festival. I asked her if she could reach out to Christopher Glass, who I was a big fan of and have kind of orbited a little bit within like being a production designer in Georgia, but have not actually been able to have the opportunity to talk to. So thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Why don't you talk a little bit about just how you got into production designing first off, before we really dig into the meat of it?
Yeah. So I got into production design in a very, um, I think, a non-traditional way. I think the typical path of getting into production design is starting out as like an assistant art director, or and then becoming an art director, or being a set designer. And a lot of people have architecture background, um, and they work their way up. Some people come through set decoration. I didn't come through any of those. So I'm I'm like, how did I become a production designer? It's kind of interesting. Well, I actually started out in storyboarding. So I storyboarded for about 12 years on commercials and movies. And and while I was storyboarding, I also did some concept art, and occasionally directors would be like, "Wow, we basically just made the set look like what you drew in the storyboard." And it even got to a point where I was on a movie, and there was a huge dispute. I'm going to leave names out just on purpose, but there was a huge dispute about a set piece that the storyboard department designed, and the production designer didn't want to do it. And then the director actually really loved it. And anyway, that's not how I became a production designer, but it was always kind of in there. And then I got into art directing visual effects for commercials, which was pretty cool. So I was designing a lot of robots. I kind of got into it by designing robots. Um, and I would art direct the robot, like in a particular commercial. There were several of them, like different robots. Um, so there'd be a different production designer doing all the sets, and then the director would have me like, "Oh, I want you to do the robot." So then I would sit with the visual effects company and basically art direct the robots. And eventually that just led to, hey, why don't you design the sets too? And I was like, sure. Like of course, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. Uh, so I kind of just, I didn't just stumble into it, but I think there's a certain level of ignorance or naivety that helps, I think, in this business, getting into anything. You just kind of like, yeah, I'll do it. And then, yeah, and then I learned basically on the job over a course of many years. And I feel like I'm still learning actually, but I feel like now I finally know what I'm doing um, at this point. But I think for years I was sort of just learning the whole time. But it's a great learning process, and I think it's a better way. For me, it was a better way to learn than getting formal education, I guess, for production design.
No, I had a very similar origin story. I was like a builder and a fabricator that just kind of had an evolution into like making things for film. I definitely did not have any sort of formal education. Do you think that there is a personality trait, I guess, that comes from like this idea of one being very interested in just figuring things out and just constantly taking in knowledge and observing things, and then also like being open to the evolution of how the industry is constantly changing. Like that's not like a trait that you can necessarily teach someone. You either like have it or you don't have it. And do you think that that had a lot to do with your success going into all of this?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I think that having an interest in how things work, I know that sounds kind of basic, but it's um I've always been interested in how movies were made, how is filmmaking done, how's the magic trick done? Because it's basically a magic trick, it's like I want to know how to do the magic tricks that they're doing. Um and that curiosity does extend uh into just a desire to figure out how things are done, and then that translates into, okay, now I'm learning how this is done and I want to do that too. um and I think maybe that's the spark that you're talking about.
Mhm.
The curiosity of
Well,
uh,
also one of the really interesting things about production designing that I wouldn't have necessarily known before I got into it is just like, for example, so I worked on Single Drunk Female, and which takes place in Boston, and I just think of the amount of hours that me and my art director sat reading books about the style of bricks in Boston versus like the style of bricks that would exist in Atlanta where we actually shot the show, and like
yeah.
how to like try to make realistic brick styles in our sets that we were building. And I mean, just the hours that we spent talking about that, you do kind of have to find that interesting, I think, to do this job.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be able to. I mean, it's good to have ADHD a little bit, which I because one of the traits of ADHD is that you hyper focus on something and ignore everything else,
Mhm.
and to the detriment usually of yourself. But that comes in handy when working on a project, is becoming very hyper focused and almost obsessive about details. And I mean, at a certain point you have to kind of break yourself away, because that can start to waste time. um and then you start to realize, well, that's only going to be on screen for like 15 seconds, so I don't know if people are going to really focused on it as much as I am right now. you know, and sometimes the directors might focus on it too, and then
Mhm.
you sort of have to just placate that, and then it just depends. I mean, I think knowing when to pick your battles, when to focus, when to hyper focus, when to become pedantic, when not to.
Mhm.
Um, that's also, it's something I've learned over the years. I think in the beginning I was very pedantic about details. I think that came out of an insecurity that I
Mhm.
had, because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. So it's like, I'm going to get really hyper detaily now, and then that'll look like I know what I'm doing.
Right.
But but as I've worked, I realized, okay, I need to know when to focus and not to
Mhm.
focus on certain things. What's in going to be in the shot, what's not going to be in the shot. And I think storyboarding has helped me with that, knowing what I think will be in the shot versus what
Right.
won't be. Um,
But at the end of the day, they also do go rogue all the time. I don't know how many times they've told me that they'll never turn around on this, and then of course they do.
yeah, I mean, you kind of have to, you kind of have to get to know the director and the DP a little bit beforehand, especially if you develop a relationship, you
Mhm.
know, then you can be like, okay, I think he's probably going to turn 360 on this. You know what I mean? And like, I could tell by the way he's directing this that he's going to turn 360 on this set. Or and that's something that came into play with like on the Jungle Book, which is a very, very technical creation. Somehow we managed to make it very organic while still being technical. But I think a lot of that was figuring out which scenes was Favreau going to want to play it loose versus
Mhm.
having it very like on the path. And literally, we created paths for this kid to walk on that were very narrow. It's almost like fashion runways of jungle, like that were like topographical fashion runways of jungle that he would walk on, and then the rest was blue, um, so that we could capture his shadow or anything he touched. Um, and that would be in camera, and then the rest would be replaced. But there were certain scenes where Jon Favreau wanted to, he wants, he's an actor, so he's like, let's let this play out, let's let it,
Mhm.
be constrained. So then our runways would have like a long runway, but then it would have a big zone at the end of the runway for them to act in. So it looked like a giant frying pan. Um, but those are the kinds of things that you just have to develop a relationship with the director and the cinematographer, and just be in close contact and communication with them about certain scenes in the story. And that, okay, this is going to be a fast scene that we're just going to go through it. Or no, this is going to be, we're going to live here for a while and we're going to see the entire set. And that's how you kind of figure out how much you need to build.
So it's interesting, like you say the word communication, because I think that that is like the thing that there's so many facets to it as a production designer, because you have to figure out a dialogue with the people that you're working with about what their expectations are. And then you're also trying to kind of have your wins as a production designer to get the things that you think are like on screen. And then a lot of times you have multiple people that aren't there, whether it's studios and then networks and things like that, that you also have to get approvals. And so there's so many things that are at your fingertips. Obviously, there's storyboards, there's concept art, there's previs, all these different things. Um, but a lot of times you don't have time to do all of that stuff. So are there certain things like in the process that gets what you want to get approved to get onto to screen, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I mean, I find that the quickest way to get stuff approved is to have concept art,
Mhm.
basically. Is very impactful concept art that explains what your ideas are and how you want to create this. For me, I I tend to concept a lot of stuff. I try not to leave any stone unturned. I let people know what's going to happen so that it's not a surprise. And I've gotten to the point now where I've kind of come full circle where now I'm a little pedantic, but I try to make the concept art actually look almost, even with set dressing, I get the set decorator involved with the concept art where we come in and they'll shop for the set deck, and then we'll get the dimensions, and then we'll get photographs, and sometimes there's models online of that couch or that chair or that armoire or whatever, or we just have to make it.
Mhm.
And we'll put it in the set and say this is what your set is going to be, and then that way there's no question as to what we're doing. And then in that regard, you can also show how it's going to be built and how it will lay out on the stage, and how it could be lit, and you can work with the DP and be like, okay, this is how I'm going to light it. So I work a lot in 3D at this point. um, that's not to say I'm against 2D, because I'm not. I believe in all different um, types of concepting. I mean, some sets only need a 2D image
Mhm.
or sketch,
Mhm.
or I'll just draw it out in pencil myself, or um, we'll do a foam core model, or
Mhm.
sometimes we'll do like an Unreal Engine model. So I think all these things for communicating help um, get your vision into the approval process,
Mhm.
because there is definitely an approval process.
Yes. And it's funny how
Yeah.
obviously it does depend on the person. I mean, um on Hawkeye, I know that they created entire environments in Unreal Engine for Eric the DP and Reese, our director, to get to figure out fight scenes in. And but because they neither of them had any experience with that, or like they're the kind of guys who want to go stand in a room with some blue tape on the floor and just like
Yeah.
work things out with the stunt guys. So they all this time, because MCU wanted it, was spent creating these things, and Reese and Eric like never used them or looked at them or anything.
Yeah, well, you have to be careful. I mean, I was storyboarding during the dawn of previs. And there's always a rivalry between storyboard artists and then previs
Mhm.
companies and previs, and you can probably sense I still have bitterness in my tone. But I did eventually become a previs supervisor, actually, and then I supervised teams of previs artists on Spider-Man 3. Um, and what I think has happened though over time is that previs is useful for very certain specific things. Like I think in the beginning they were trying to use it to replace storyboards and trying to use it for everything. And I think that's kind of a waste of time and money. And I think a lot of people figure that out. So um, it's very specific now. I think previs is good for like tech viz and figuring out like, is the crane going to hit the ceiling over here at this point? Or, there's a car chase. So we need to figure out with the camera moves, and just a lot of visual effects, you might need it. But anyway, that's also, once I became a production designer, that has not crept in, but it's become a part of it. So, like for instance, I was on a project where uh, it was The Dark Tower, which is it's not as bad as of a movie as as the reviewers have said. I just think because it was nothing like the book, everyone hated it, which I kind of agree with. Like, why not just make it the book? But anyway, there was a previs team that was prevising the sequence with a Ferris wheel in the woods that was like collapsed, and there's this monster jumping up on it and chasing the kid and Idris Alba. And so they did all this previs and blah blah blah. They spent all this time and money, but they weren't consulting the production designer. And it was kind of like, okay, so I got the previs, and then um, there's a reality of budget and physics, and then there's also the previs, and then the previs had this Ferris wheel that was like 200 feet in diameter, and or what, it was even bigger, I think. And then it was so huge that there was no way that we could have built it like that ever. So I was like, well, this thing is going to be a lot smaller and it's going to be more realistic. So you're going to have to change your previs, and then, but by then it was too late and they couldn't because they already spent like an enormous amount of money. So I find that to be, I find those kinds of things are snags in the filmmaking process. And I always encourage producers to, I think the Unreal Engine to me is a better use of technology versus previs, because then the actual DP and the director can go in and kind of, and the production designer can go in, and then the sets have some reality to them, and they can design their shots if they need to. Um, yes, can it be overused? Absolutely. I wouldn't use it for everything ever. I think it's only for certain circumstances and sequences. I think overusing something like that is just a waste of time and money. I mean, I think sometimes a foam core model is better than all of that.
Mhm.
So it just depends on for me, it's, I don't know what they did on Hawkeye. I know that for instance, Miss Marvel, we did use the Unreal Engine for a couple sequences, but I think the main one that we used it for actually was the AvengerCon scene with the giant Avenger fan convention sequence. Because there were a lot of effects, there was a lot of stunts. Ant-Man's head falls off and rolls through the whole crowd, but also there was a practical reason because I had to go to Thailand to shoot or to
Mhm.
start doing episodes 4 and 5 with Charmine, the director, and I couldn't be in Atlanta. So I was like, and I had to still art direct that set of the um AvengerCon. So I was like, how am I going to do this? And I'm like, oh, well, we're going to put this all in Unreal. It drove everyone nuts and my crew, especially the set decorator, Kathy Orlando. I love her. But we got all the set deck in there. We figured out how to dress the set remotely while I was actually and COVID quarantine. And I didn't have COVID, but Thailand made you stay in a hotel room for 2 weeks, so I couldn't
Hmm.
do anything. So I was just art directing that set really late at night because of the time difference with my crew. And then during the day, I was trying to prep and figure out the sets that we were doing in Thailand, which actually we use traditional models for those. We use foam core
Hmm.
um, for like the train for uh, the the big train scene at the end of episode 5 and or no 4. I'm sorry. The partition sequence, that whole thing. Um, but yeah, you have to be judicious in what tools you use. Especially, I guess producers will start to question like, why are you doing this? Or, but the thing about something like the Unreal Engine is that it's actually scalable. Like people think, oh, you know, like a Jungle Book, we had a VAD, a virtual art department with, 75 people. But you can literally you can have an Unreal artist and a set designer and concept person, and you have then 3 people and you have a team, that you can scale this technology for what your needs are. Then you can always keep them on only for a certain amount of time. um and then but it's all useful to me. I use all the tools as much as I can.
So it's so with Jungle Book in particular, like that was all CG. They avoided like motion capture and things like that. But obviously, like we have AI, we have motion capture, we have all these different like digital, we have volumes, and like that idea. As far as the future goes, and the way that that everything is evolving, part of the problem I feel is that, again, like the people who are making the decisions about what to do a lot of times don't necessarily like understand the technology or the limitations and things like that, and so they don't know how to utilize it, and a lot of times that ends up being, you know um, either a lot of money is wasted, or one of the big things that I've even run into on some particular projects I've worked on is that there was so much money that was just lit on fire on the back end because we didn't have enough. No one wanted to spend the time to figure out all the stuff on the front end. I guess with Jungle Book, uh, the decision of exactly like to do CG as opposed to motion capture, which motion capture at the time was like very sexy or whatever, like was like up and coming, like that was what everybody was green lighting, was like this idea of motion capture. Like how did you guys get to do CG and that decision to do that?
Well, we actually did. There was a whole motion capture phase on Jungle Book. So just to be clear, I mean, we definitely had motion capture technology. Um, in that instance, I mean, but in hindsight, I don't think we needed to do as much motion capture as we did, and I think also on Lion King they didn't end up using as much motion capture technology as what you would think. I mean, I think Avatar and even before that there was the Polar Express and these kinds of movies that um, utilized motion capture, and I think like Polar Express and I'm not sure about Avatar, but um, they use the information gathered from motion capture uh, very like it carried through the pipeline and it lived to the end product. Whereas in Jungle Book, it really didn't. And for those who aren't familiar with motion capture, it's where people wear the funny suits with ping pong balls all over them, and they're running around in a gray stage that's very flat lit, and they look silly. That's motion capture. If you really want to see a great example of it, look at Benedict Cumberbatch as Smog the Dragon on YouTube, and you will see that that's really embarrassing. So the way that we made Jungle Book is we basically made the movie. It almost seems like 3 or 4 times. There was a storyboard phase of the movie where the entire movie was storyboarded in animatic, and that's a term that we use for sort of partially animated storyboards. That was edited together with like a radio play version of the movie. a lot of the people that were doing the radio play were just like us. I didn't do it, but Favreau and then some other people in the crew were like, they became the characters for this radio play. Then the editor was editing all this together. So we had a complete storyboard animatic version of the movie. And then from that is when we started designing sets and these are all in the virtual world. So these are virtual sets. And at the time, we weren't using Unreal, we were using Unity, which was very clunky at the time. And then there was a motion capture phase of the movie. So basically, we shot the whole movie in motion capture with rudimentary backgrounds and some animation and for the characters. And it also gave Favreau a great chance to work with this kid who Neil, who'd never acted before. So basically, he rehearsed the whole movie um, over a summer and got to do the whole movie beforehand, before actually shooting it, which was fantastic for everyone for that. Um, but a lot of that information, I think, then was replaced by animators. The animators then came in and they actually just started animating um, the characters, especially the quadruped character, like a cat and a bear. We made all these puppets and we tried like attaching people with pool noodles. If you think the Benedict Cumberbatch video is embarrassing, you should have seen the pool noodle Bagheera that we had on the. It was like two guys attached together with a pool noodle. It didn't really work. So all that was thrown out basically. And then, but what we did discover from that process was how much set we needed to build, like where the kid was going to walk, and that was important, like where he was going to interact with the actual jungle and all that kind of stuff. So from that, we started to build 3D sets of exactly the slices of sets where he was going to walk out of our big digital worlds that we created. We're like, okay, he's only going to walk on this path this way. And then, like I said, we'll give him like a zone to have more free play. And that's how we built our sets. And then we actually shot it. And it was originally planned to be a 30-day shoot because I don't know what they were thinking, but it became almost 100 days. But it worked great. I mean, I think it was a great process. But I think you're right. I mean, I think motion capture, it's like what previs in the early days became like the thing, and then motion capture became the thing, and then it's like, okay, now we know we don't need to use it so much. Sometimes it's just reference or for blocking. We discovered that blocking was more important than animating every facial expression. Like all that became not as useful when you translate it to a cat or a wolf talking. It's more useful when you're translating it to like the orangutan, like the giant um, King Louis, because his face is closer to a human face. And actually, Favreau played him. He acted him in motion capture, and then Christopher Walken was the voice, which is kind of interesting. Um, But I think now, I think the volume, there's different types of volumes. There's a capture volume, which is like the motion capture volume. There's like an array of cameras everywhere that follows the ping pong balls on the people. Um, then there's the volume, like Mandalorian volume, which uses some of the same technology where you have cameras everywhere and it tracks the camera and it knows where the camera is going to be at any given moment, and then it adjusts the background according to the position of the camera and the focal length and the what it's doing, so that perspective actually changes, so that like when you watch a third person camera of a LED volume, it looks funny because you see like this weird window that moves around with the actors and you're like, how does that even work? But it's actually, all that matters is what the camera sees. So it's adjusting for the camera. Um, and I think also there's a place for that technology and there's a great use of it. But I think there can also be an overuse of it. And then I know that a lot of times things have to be replaced in post. anyway. Um, but it does still give you a lot of light interaction that is critical for for integrating characters into a fictitious world,
Mhm.
especially if they have armor like Mandalorian, because it'll it'll reflect all the
Mhm.
lights in the environment, and so it's very useful for something like that. They also use it in the Batman. Um, I'm friends with James Chinlin, the production designer, and I was like, did you use LED when they're on top of the building? You know, like, and he's like, yeah, we did. You know, it looks great. I mean, it looks because you see all the reflections in the puddles of water, and
Right.
I mean, I mean, I've used it. I've never done an entire movie using an LED volume, but we've used it in bits and pieces, and then it's starting to creep its way into commercials. The problem with is that it needs so much lead time to get it up and running that a lot of the times commercials they can't use it, or it has to be kind of a lower version of it where it's not as cool, I guess, as something like The Mandalorian. So
Well, speaking of commercials, the first thing that I ever saw of yours and was absolutely obsessed with was the Spike Jones HomePods, which was done obviously like was a practical marvel essentially that was like so cool. I probably watched it like 30 times when it came out. But it had such like a Time Bandits kind of vibe to it that like Terry Gilliam was like a big part of me wanting to even get into making films.
that's
But obviously like Spike Jones, like having an advocate like Spike Jones that loves the practical process is like obviously like very important to the process. But how, first off, I guess my question is like, what point in your career were you that that you were able to get them to like trust you with a project like that? And then how much of a part of like figuring out the design of everything versus like what Spike Jones wanted versus like what ended up being on screen? Like what was that like?
um well, what point was I in my career? Well, first of all, I just want to you mentioned Time Bandits, which is kind of interesting because that was actually one of my big influences in making that set, especially when they pushed the wall. You
Yep.
know, that was one of our references was Time Bandits. But anyway, where was I in my career? Well, at that point, I thought my career was literally in the toilet because I just finished doing a toilet commercial for Kohler, but it was like a $7,000 toilet, so maybe that's not so bad. But that also had a bunch of robots in it and all this stuff. But anyway, so coming off of that and some other stuff, and yeah, I mean, I how did I meet up with him? Well, I think the producer knew me. I worked a lot with the producer, so she brought me in, and I was definitely like the underdog in the process because they were looking at a bunch of other production designers who had like much bigger, fantastic, Academy Award winning resumes than myself. But I think we just hit it off in the meeting. Um, Sometimes it's hard to tell like why they chose you versus somebody else, and I mean, I had a lookbook of references and things, and he dug all that, and I think we just kind of hit it off, and then it was actually going to be two commercials. It's funny because the one that was going to be the easier one actually was all underwater. It's like normally that's not the easier one.
No.